There are moments in history that defy explanation, incidents so bizarre and unsettling that they seem to belong more to the realm of science fiction than to the documented records of military operations. Yet, buried deep within classified files, hidden behind layers of official denial and bureaucratic obfuscation, lie accounts of encounters that challenge everything we think we know about our place in the universe. What I'm about to share with you is one such account, a story that involves trained military personnel, multiple credible witnesses, physical evidence, and an event so extraordinary that it has haunted those who experienced it for more than 4 decades. This is the story of what happened on a cold January night in 1978, at a secure military installation in New Jersey, when an armed security guard allegedly came face to face with something not of this world, made a split-second decision that would change his life forever, and became the first and perhaps only American serviceman to have killed an extraterrestrial being on United States soil. But before we dive into that fateful night, we need to understand the context, the location, and the long shadow of secrecy that the United States military has cast over the subject of unidentified aerial phenomena for the better part of a century. The relationship between the American armed forces and UFOs is far more complex and documented than most people realize. Stretching back to the earliest days of the Cold War, when pilots began reporting strange objects in the skies that moved in ways that defied the laws of physics as we understood them. From the infamous Roswell incident in 1947, where something crashed in the New Mexico desert, and the military first claimed it was a flying saucer, before hastily retracting that statement and insisting it was merely a weather balloon, to the Rendlesham Forest encounter in 1980, where multiple U.S. Air Force personnel stationed at RAF Woodbridge in England reported witnessing a metallic craft landing in the woods and even touched its surface, leaving physical traces that were later documented and photographed. These incidents form a pattern that is impossible to ignore. Yet for decades, the official position of the United States government was one of dismissal and ridicule. With Project Blue Book, the Air Force's official UFO investigation program that ran from 1952 to 1969, concluding that the vast majority of sightings could be explained as misidentifications, natural phenomena, or hoaxes, even though a significant percentage of cases remained genuinely unexplained and deeply troubling to the investigators who studied them. Then, in the early months of 2020, something remarkable happened that would force even the most hardened skeptics to reconsider their positions. The Pentagon, that fortress of military secrecy and operational security, convened an unprecedented series of briefing sessions with representatives from major media organizations around the world, meetings that had not been scheduled in advance, but were instead prompted by an avalanche of questions and mounting pressure from journalists who had gotten wind of something extraordinary. At the center of this media storm were 3 videos, grainy but unmistakable pieces of footage captured by the advanced sensor systems aboard U.S. Navy fighter jets, showing objects that appeared to defy the fundamental laws of aerodynamics and propulsion. These weren't blurry dots of light, filmed by amateurs with shaky cameras. These were high-definition infrared recordings made by some of the most sophisticated detection equipment ever designed, operated by highly trained military aviators who knew exactly what conventional aircraft looked like and how they performed. And what they had captured on film was something else entirely. The objects in these videos moved at speeds that would have generated G-forces sufficient to pulverize any human pilot. They executed instantaneous 90-degree turns without any visible means of propulsion. They hovered motionless against hurricane-force winds. And in one particularly striking piece of footage, an object appeared to rotate in mid-flight while maintaining its trajectory, behavior that no known aircraft on Earth could replicate. For months before the Pentagon's official confirmation, these videos had been circulating on the internet, downloaded and analyzed frame by amateur investigators, aviation experts, physicists, and UFO researchers who collectively represented millions of hours of scrutiny. And the consensus among those who studied the footage seriously was clear. Whatever these objects were, they represented technology far beyond anything in the public domain and quite possibly beyond anything possessed by any nation on Earth. When Pentagon officials finally stepped before the cameras and microphones to address the issue, They did something that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. They confirmed without equivocation that the videos were authentic, that they had indeed been recorded by US military personnel during training exercises, and that the objects depicted were genuinely unidentified. This wasn't some low-level press officer reading a prepared statement. This was an acknowledgement from the highest levels of the Department of Defense that something unknown had repeatedly penetrated, restricted military airspace, and that the phenomena represented a potential national security concern worthy of serious investigation. Members of the United States Senate were briefed behind closed doors. Specialized task forces were established within the military intelligence apparatus, and for the first time in generations, the conversation about UFOs, or UAPs as they are now officially designated, unidentified aerial phenomena, moved from the fringes of conspiracy theory into the mainstream of national security discourse. Yet even as this apparent transparency was being celebrated by those who had long demanded disclosure, seasoned observers and veteran researchers couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right about the entire presentation, that this carefully orchestrated release of information felt less like genuine openness and more like a controlled drip feed designed to serve purposes that remained opaque. After all, if the government was now willing to admit that unidentified craft were regularly violating American airspace with impunity, why were they only releasing footage from recent years? What about the decades of encounters, crashes, retrievals, and alleged face-to-face meetings that whistleblowers from within the military and intelligence communities had been reporting for generations? The suspicion among many researchers was that these recent videos were being used as a limited hangout, an intelligence community term for the practice of releasing some true information in order to distract from or conceal even more explosive truths that remain hidden. Whistleblowers from within the armed forces, both retired personnel willing to speak on the record and active duty members communicating through anonymous channels, have consistently maintained that the true history of military interaction with UFOs and their occupants is far more extensive, far more intimate, and far more disturbing than anything the government has been willing to acknowledge publicly. These sources have described elaborate programs of retrieval and reverse engineering, claiming that when UFOs crash or are forced down, specialized teams are deployed to secure the wreckage and transport it to secure facilities, where teams of scientists and engineers attempt to understand and replicate the technology. The most frequently mentioned location for such activities is Area 51, the legendary facility in the Nevada desert, officially known as Groom Lake, a place so secret that the US government refused to even acknowledge its existence until 2013, despite the fact that it had been operational since the 1950s and was clearly visible in satellite imagery. According to multiple sources, Area 51 and other similar installations scattered across the American Southwest have been the sites of the most classified research programs in human history. Projects aimed at understanding propulsion systems that appear to manipulate gravity itself, materials that are lighter and stronger than anything in our periodic table, and energy sources that could revolutionize civilization if they could be understood and replicated. Some of the technological advances that emerged from the American aerospace industry during the Cold War and beyond have been attributed by various whistleblowers to this reverse engineering effort. The sudden leap to stealth technology that made aircraft effectively invisible to radar. The development of advanced composite materials that shouldn't have been possible with the metallurgical knowledge of the time, and even rumors of experimental craft that use some form of electromagnetic propulsion rather than conventional jet engines or rockets. But the claims go far beyond mere technology transfer. Some of the most controversial and disturbing allegations involve not just the recovery of craft, but the recovery of their occupants, both living and dead. There are persistent reports, corroborated by multiple independent sources across different time periods, of vast underground facilities extending deep beneath the surface of the Earth, connected by networks of high-speed transit tunnels that allow for rapid movement of personnel and materials between installations without any surface trace of activity. The most extreme claims venture into territory that sounds like pure science fiction. Assertions of joint research programs between human scientists and alien beings. Experiments in genetics and hybridization aimed at creating new forms of life that combine human and extraterrestrial DNA, and even reports of violent conflicts that have erupted in these underground facilities when cooperation broke down, resulting in casualties on both sides and lockdowns that lasted for days while military forces attempted to regain control. Official spokespeople for the military and intelligence agencies have, without exception, dismissed these accounts as fantasies, the products of overactive imaginations, deliberate disinformation, or the delusions of individuals seeking attention or suffering from psychological disturbances. Yet the stories persist and multiply, and a disturbing number of them come from individuals with verified military service records, security clearances, and documented access to classified facilities and programs. People who have everything to lose and nothing to gain by coming forward with accounts that expose them to ridicule, professional destruction, and potentially legal jeopardy for violating secrecy oaths. The story I'm about to tell you in detail is one of these accounts, not as extreme as some, not as thoroughly documented as others, but unique in one critical respect. If the witnesses are to be believed, this is one of the very few cases in which military personnel allegedly engaged in a direct, lethal confrontation with an extraterrestrial being, and it took place not in some remote desert or deep underground installation, but on an active military base in one of the most densely populated regions of the United States, with multiple witnesses and a chain of events that was documented, at least initially, through official military channels before the entire incident was allegedly suppressed and buried under layers of classification and denial. To truly understand what happened on that January night in 1978, we need to first understand the location where it occurred, because Fort Dix and McGuire Air Force Base are not isolated. Area 51-style facilities hidden away in the desert where strange events can unfold far from civilian eyes. These are major military installations located in Burlington County, New Jersey, less than 20 miles from the state capital of Trenton, and within easy driving distance of both Philadelphia and New York City, surrounded by suburban communities, traversed by public roads, and home to thousands of military personnel, civilian contractors, and their families. Fort Dix was originally established in 1917 during the desperate early days of World War I, when the United States was frantically mobilizing forces to send to the blood-soaked trenches of Europe, and it served as one of the primary training and staging grounds for soldiers being prepared for deployment overseas. The facility expanded dramatically during World War II, processing hundreds of thousands of troops through its gates, and it continued to serve that function through the Korean War, the Vietnam conflict, and beyond, becoming one of the Army's most important installations on the East Coast, a place where generation after generation of American soldiers received their final preparation before being sent to war zones around the world. Adjacent to Fort Dix, sharing a common boundary marked by nothing more substantial than a chain-link fence in many places, sits McGuire Air Force Base, which began as a small auxiliary airfield, but was rapidly expanded during the 1940s and 1950s to become a major Air Force installation specializing in airlift operations, transport command, and aerial refueling. The proximity of these two bases created a unique military complex where Army and Air Force operations intersected constantly, with personnel, vehicles, and equipment regularly crossing between the two installations in the course of daily operations, and where security patrols from both services sometimes covered overlapping areas, particularly along the shared perimeter, where the boundary between Army and Air Force jurisdiction was more theoretical than physical. The terrain surrounding this military complex is quintessentially southern New Jersey, vast stretches of pine forest, interspersed with sandy soil and scrubby vegetation, flat and open in some areas and densely wooded in others, with the wilderness of the Pine Barrens, that mysterious and folklore-rich region that we've examined in previous episodes, lying just a few miles to the east. This is important context because the Pine Barrens has been the site of countless strange sightings over the centuries, from the legendary Jersey Devil that is said to haunt those woods to mysterious lights in the sky, unexplained phenomena, and disappearances that have never been satisfactorily explained, creating an atmosphere where the boundary between the normal and the paranormal feels somehow thinner than in other places. It was in this setting, In the early morning darkness of January 18, 1978, that a series of events began to unfold that would involve both military installations, dozens of witnesses, and an encounter that would be discussed, debated, investigated, suppressed, and ultimately transformed into one of the most compelling UFO-related cases in American military history. The incident began quietly, almost unremarkably, in the control tower at McGuire Air Force Base, where technicians were conducting routine monitoring of air traffic and airspace in the region, a responsibility that involved both civilian aircraft using nearby commercial airports and military flights associated with the base's operations. At some point during those pre-dawn hours, one of the radar operators noticed something unusual on his display, a contact that appeared without any corresponding flight plan, without any radio communication, without any of the identifying information that should have accompanied any authorized aircraft in that airspace. This in itself wasn't necessarily cause for alarm. Radar contacts could be generated by weather phenomena, by flocks of birds, by equipment malfunctions, or by aircraft that had inadvertently strayed into restricted airspace without proper clearance, situations that were irregular but not unheard of and could typically be resolved with a radio call or a visual check. Following standard procedures, one of the technicians left the confines of the control room and stepped out onto the external observation platform, a balcony-like structure that offered an unobstructed view of the surrounding airspace and terrain, and he raised his binoculars to scan the horizon in the direction indicated by the radar contact. What he saw made him pause, not a conventional aircraft or anything that immediately made sense, but a strange luminescence, a glow that seemed to emanate from somewhere near ground level in the direction of Fort Dix's perimeter, a light that didn't behave like a searchlight or vehicle headlights or any other normal illumination source, but rather seemed to pulse or shimmer with an otherworldly quality that the technician would later struggle to adequately describe. He was still focused on this mysterious light source, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, when it simply vanished, not gradually dimming or moving away as a conventional light source would, but simply ceasing to exist, as if someone had thrown a switch and cut the power instantly and completely. Somewhat unsettled but not yet alarmed, the technician returned to the control room to report what he had observed, only to be told by his colleagues that at the precise moment the light had disappeared from view, the radar contact they had been tracking had also vanished from their screens, the timing so exact that it couldn't possibly be coincidental, suggesting that whatever had been generating both the visual phenomenon and the radar return had either departed at incredible speed or had somehow simply ceased to exist as a detectable object. The correlation between the visual sighting and the radar anomaly elevated the situation from merely curious to potentially significant, and following proper protocol, the Air Force Control Tower personnel contacted their counterparts at Fort Dix's Security Operations Center, reported what they had observed, and requested that a patrol be dispatched to the area where the light had been seen to investigate whether there was any sign of intrusion, equipment malfunction, or any other explanation for the unusual activity. Having made the report and handed off the responsibility to Fort Dix security, the Air Force personnel largely dismissed the incident from their minds, filed it away as one of those odd occurrences that occasionally punctuate military service, and returned to their routine duties, completely unaware that they had just initiated a sequence of events that would, within the next hour, result in the death of a being from another world and the mobilization of a cover-up operation that would span decades and extend to the highest levels of the American military and intelligence establishment. When the report from McGuire's control tower arrived at Fort Dix's Security Operations Center, the response was exactly what you would expect from professional military police, dealing with what appeared to be a relatively minor anomaly. A single patrol car was dispatched with a lone security guard, tasked with driving the perimeter road, checking the fence line for signs of intrusion or damage, and visually sweeping the area where the light had been reported. This was standard operating procedure for such situations, not a full alert or mobilization, but a routine check that would either confirm that everything was normal or identify a problem that required further response. The identity of the specific guard who conducted this patrol has never been officially confirmed, and throughout the decades since the incident, he has been referred to only generically as the sentry or the military policeman or the guard, either because he requested anonymity as part of whatever agreement was reached after the events, or because the military has deliberately obscured his identity to prevent independent researchers from tracking him down and corroborating his account. What we do know, based on information that has emerged through various channels over the years, is that this individual was conducting a methodical patrol along the sections of fence line that marked the boundary between Fort Dix and McGuire Air Force Base. Driving slowly, periodically stopping to sweep areas with his spotlight, following a route that would take him along approximately half the length of the shared perimeter, when something caused him to bring his vehicle to a complete and sudden stop. According to the accounts that have reached the public, what the guard saw before him was something that, in that initial moment of recognition, must have caused his mind to simply freeze in confusion because it contradicted everything that should have been possible in that location at that time. A craft of some kind, hovering silently in the air just a few feet above the ground, positioned adjacent to the fence line, making no sound whatsoever, despite the fact that it was clearly maintaining its position against gravity. The object, as described by the guard in his initial reports before those reports were allegedly confiscated and buried, was roughly cylindrical in shape, approximately the size of a compact car, constructed from something that appeared to be metal, but which had an unusual surface quality that seemed to emit its own light. A deep reddish glow that pulsed rhythmically, almost organically, as if the craft itself was somehow alive, or as if its power source was cycling in a regular rhythm that manifested as variations in the intensity of the light it emitted. The guard, trained to assess threats and respond to unusual situations, sat in his vehicle for what was probably only seconds, but must have felt like an eternity, trying to process what he was seeing and categorize it into some framework that made sense. Was this some new experimental aircraft from McGuire that he hadn't been briefed about? Was it some kind of sophisticated drone or remote-operated vehicle? Was it potentially a foreign intrusion, espionage platform, or hostile reconnaissance asset that had somehow penetrated this far into secure American airspace and was now hovering brazenly over a military installation? The complete absence of sound was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the encounter, because even the most advanced helicopters produce a distinctive roar. Fixed-wing aircraft generate the whine of jet engines or the drone of propellers, but this object simply floated there in defiant silence, its only acknowledgement of the physical laws of the universe being the red glow that pulsed across its surface. The guard, making a decision that he was probably already second-guessing even as he was executing it, rolled down the window of his patrol vehicle and sat there in the cold January air, listening intently for any sound that might give him a clue about what kind of propulsion system this craft was using. But the only sounds that reached his ears were completely mundane. The whisper of wind moving through the pine trees that dotted the area, the distant cry of some nocturnal animal going about its business in the woods, the faint ambient noise of a military base at night, but nothing, absolutely nothing, that could account for how this object was maintaining its position in mid-air without any visible means of support. Then, cutting through the silence like a knife, came a sound that was very much of this world, the crunch and scatter of footsteps moving rapidly across the gravel and sandy soil somewhere nearby. The unmistakable sound of someone or something moving quickly toward the hovering craft. The guard's attention snapped away from the object itself and toward the direction of the approaching footfalls. And there, emerging from the darkness just beyond the reach of the reddish glow cast by the craft, was a figure, humanoid in its basic shape but wrong in its proportions and in the way it moved, running toward the hovering object with a gait that the guard would later describe as simultaneously childlike and utterly alien. In that moment, the guard's training took over, his mind defaulting to the scenarios he had been drilled on repeatedly during his security instruction. Unauthorized individual, potential espionage situation, possible attempt to access or retrieve what might be enemy technology. He made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life and would alter the course of this entire incident, transforming it from a mere sighting into something far more serious and irreversible. The guard pushed open the door of his vehicle, drew his sidearm, and fired a single warning shot into the air, the crack of the gunshot shattering the eerie silence and echoing across the open ground. And he shouted, his voice carrying the command authority that military police are trained to project, ordering the running figure to stop immediately, to identify itself, to get down on the ground. The response was instantaneous and stunning. The craft, which had been hovering motionless just feet above the ground, suddenly accelerated straight upward, with a velocity that should have been impossible, rising vertically into the night sky so quickly that the human eye could barely track it, moving from stationary to what must have been hundreds or thousands of miles per hour in literally zero time, with no gradual acceleration, no buildup of thrust, just an instantaneous transition from motionless to gone, vanishing into the darkness above and leaving no trace except the rapidly fading afterimage of that reddish glow on the guard's retinas. The sudden departure of the craft and the light it had been emitting plunged the area into relative darkness, and the running figure, now deprived of its apparent objective, had also disappeared into the shadows. But the guard, his adrenaline surging and his training overriding any impulse to simply freeze in shock at what he had just witnessed, grabbed his flashlight and began scanning the area, sweeping the beam back and forth across the terrain, searching for any sign of the intruder. Within seconds, the beam caught the figure again, now at some distance from where it had been, moving away from the guard's position, running in the opposite direction with surprising speed given the rough terrain and the darkness. The guard, now fully committed to the pursuit and responding to the situation as a straightforward security breach, regardless of the otherworldly context that surrounded it, set off in pursuit on foot, tracking the fleeing figure with his flashlight while repeatedly shouting commands for it to stop, warning that he would use deadly force if necessary, following every protocol for confronting an intruder in a secure military area. Then came a moment that must have seemed almost surreal, even in the context of everything else that had already happened. The running figure, illuminated by the guard's flashlight and silhouetted against the lights from the distant base buildings, suddenly launched itself upward in a leap that carried it impossibly high, clearing the chain-link fence that marked the boundary between Fort Dix and McGuire Air Force Base with an effortless vault that no normal human being could have executed, landing on the opposite side within the Air Force Base's jurisdiction and immediately resuming its sprint, now running across one of McGuire's concrete runways, fully exposed under the security lighting that illuminated the airfield. The guard, unable to physically follow because scaling the fence would have required time he didn't have, and because there were protocols about crossing between Army and Air Force areas without proper coordination, came to a sliding stop at the fence line, raised his weapon, steadied his aim as best he could while still breathing hard from the pursuit, tracked the running figure, and made a decision that would literally echo through the decades to come. He fired 5 shots in rapid succession, military-trained center-mass shooting, and at least several of those rounds found their target, striking the fleeing figure in the torso and causing it to pitch forward, its momentum carrying it a few more stumbling steps before it crashed to the concrete surface of the runway and lay motionless. For a moment, the guard simply stood there at the fence line, his weapon still raised, his mind trying to catch up with the cascade of impossible things that had just happened in the span of perhaps 2 or 3 minutes. And then reality reasserted itself and training took over once again. He had just shot someone or something on a military installation. He needed to report it immediately. He needed to secure the scene. He needed backup. He needed medical assistance in case the subject was still alive. He needed to set in motion all the procedures that govern such incidents. The guard ran back to his patrol vehicle, grabbed the radio, and sent out an emergency call that must have sounded absolutely insane to anyone who heard it. He had encountered an unknown intruder, had pursued it onto McGuire Air Force Base, had opened fire, and the subject was down. But the circumstances were unlike anything covered in any manual or training scenario. Within minutes, the emergency response system of both installations had been activated. Patrol vehicles from both Fort Dix and McGuire were converging on the location. The guard was given clearance to enter McGuire through the main gate, and he drove at speed across the base to the section of runway where he had last seen the subject fall. When he arrived, he found several Air Force security personnel already on scene, standing in a loose circle around something on the ground, and the expressions on their faces reflected confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror at what they were looking at. As the guard approached and joined the circle, he got his first clear, close-up look at what he had shot, And whatever certainty he might have had that he was dealing with a foreign agent or a trespasser evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold existential dread that must have settled into his bones like ice. The body lying on the concrete was roughly the size of a 10 or 12-year-old child, but that was where any resemblance to a human being ended abruptly. The head was disproportionately large, taking up perhaps a third of the total body length, with a cranium that bulged in the back and came to a more pointed configuration at what would be considered the chin. The face, if you could call it that, was almost featureless, lacking the complexity of structure that defines human faces, with no visible nose to speak of, no apparent mouth in any conventional sense, just a minimal slit or opening that suggested where one might be, and no ears at all that anyone could identify. But the eyes were what drew and held the attention of everyone present. Oversized almond-shaped organs that were solid black or very dark gray, with no visible sclera, no discernible pupil or iris, just these huge, glossy, reflective surfaces that, even in death, seemed to be staring at nothing and everything simultaneously, holding some kind of terrible knowledge or judgment that humans were not equipped to comprehend. The body itself was not clothed in any conventional sense, or rather, if it was wearing a garment, the garment was so perfectly form-fitting and so seamlessly integrated with the body that it was impossible to determine where one ended and the other began. The surface had a texture that multiple witnesses described as leathery or reptilian, with a quality that suggested very tough, durable biological tissue rather than fabric or synthetic material, colored in shades of gray or gray-green that seemed to shift slightly depending on the angle of view and the lighting conditions. Most disturbing of all, perhaps, was the smell, a powerful, acrid odor that filled the immediate area, a stench that several witnesses described as similar to ammonia, that harsh, eye-watering chemical smell that clears your sinuses and makes you want to gag, a scent so strong and so unpleasant that it made standing near the body almost intolerable, as if the biochemistry of this being was so fundamentally different from terrestrial life that even in death it was off-gassing compounds that were alien and toxic to human senses. The assembled guards and security personnel stood around this impossible thing, this dead creature that shouldn't exist according to everything they had been taught about biology, anthropology, and the supposed isolation of Earth in a vast, empty cosmos, and they were faced with an absolutely unprecedented question. What the hell were they supposed to do now? Who were they supposed to report this to? What words could possibly appear in an incident report that would make this situation make sense? And what kind of shitstorm was about to descend on all of them for being involved in something that would either make history or destroy their careers, or quite possibly both? The answer to that question began to materialize several hours later, when Major George Filer, an Air Force intelligence officer assigned to McGuire Air Force Base, arrived for his regular duty shift in the pre-dawn darkness, completely unaware that anything unusual had occurred during the night. Filer, whose responsibilities included compiling intelligence reports and briefings for senior commanders, and occasionally for members of Congress and Senate committees with oversight of military affairs, drove through the main gate of McGuire at approximately 4 in the morning, a time when the base should have been quiet and mostly dormant, with only essential personnel on duty. Instead, as he approached the gate, he noticed unusual activity. Several vehicles with their headlights on were clustered together out on one of the runways, which was not normal for that hour, and which immediately sparked his curiosity as someone trained to notice anomalies and investigate irregularities. Being naturally inquisitive, and also having the security clearance that allowed him to ask questions that others might not be authorized to pursue, Filer rolled down his window as he reached the security checkpoint and asked the guards on duty what was happening, why there were vehicles out on the runway at 4 in the morning, whether there had been an accident or an emergency of some kind that he should be aware of. The response he received was so unexpected, so completely outside the realm of anything he had anticipated, that his first instinct was to assume it was a joke, some kind of early morning humor from guards who were bored and tired from pulling the night shift. One of the security personnel, in a tone that Filer would later recall as being oddly quiet and serious rather than joking, told him that a guard from Fort Dix had shot and killed an alien earlier that morning, and that the body was currently out on the runway being secured by multiple units, while senior command decided what to do with it. Filer, Despite his intelligence background and his access to classified information on a wide range of subjects, did what almost anyone would do when told something that absurd. He laughed, made some dismissive comment about guards needing to lay off the coffee, and proceeded toward his office, putting the comment out of his mind as he focused on the work he needed to accomplish during his shift. But as he was parking his vehicle near the command post building that housed his office, something happened that made him reconsider his dismissal of the guard's statement. A large military aircraft, a C-141 Starlifter, one of the Air Force's primary long-range cargo planes, was approaching the runway in a landing pattern, its navigation lights cutting through the fading darkness. And this was unusual because the C-141 was not a standard aircraft at McGuire. It was typically associated with military airlift command and strategic transport operations. And having one arrive at 4 in the morning without any advance notification on the daily operations schedule struck Filer as significant, possibly connected to whatever had prompted the unusual activity he had observed when arriving on base. Suddenly, the guard's offhand comment about shooting an alien didn't seem quite so ridiculous anymore, for at least the situation it referred to, whatever the actual explanation might be, was clearly serious enough to warrant the dispatch of a large transport aircraft in the middle of the night. Filer had barely reached his office and begun sorting through the classified message traffic that had accumulated overnight when he received a summons from his commanding officer, a direct order to report immediately for a briefing regarding a security incident that had occurred during the early morning hours. During that meeting, Filer received confirmation that something extraordinary had indeed taken place. An intruder of some kind had been encountered by Fort Dix security, had been pursued onto McGuire Air Force Base, had been shot and killed, and the nature of the deceased subject was sufficiently unusual that it required immediate investigation and documentation at multiple levels of command. Filer was instructed to take charge of compiling a comprehensive report on the incident, which meant conducting interviews with all involved personnel, gathering statements from witnesses, collecting any physical evidence that had been secured, examining photographs that had been taken of the deceased subject, and preparing a detailed summary that could be forwarded up the chain of command and potentially shared with congressional oversight committees that had jurisdiction over military affairs and national security matters. This was exactly the kind of sensitive, unusual assignment that intelligence officers with Filer's experience and clearances were trained to handle. Situations that fell outside normal operational parameters and required both discretion and thoroughness. Over the course of the next several hours, Filer moved through the base conducting his investigation, speaking with military police officers from both Fort Dix and McGuire, interviewing the control tower personnel who had observed the initial radar contact and visual sighting, taking statements from the guards who had been first on scene after the shooting, and piecing together a timeline of events that, while still bizarre and difficult to fully accept, was at least consistent across multiple independent witnesses, which gave the account a degree of credibility that could not be easily dismissed. Many of the personnel he interviewed appeared exhausted. That individual never returned to Fort Dix after his departure, and rumors circulated among those with knowledge of the case that he had been transferred to some other classified facility, possibly given a new identity, or perhaps simply discharged from service under circumstances that would make it difficult for researchers to track him down and verify his account. A common pattern in cases where the military wants to ensure that inconvenient witnesses disappear from public view and become untraceable. For decades after these events, Major Filer, who went on to have a distinguished military career before eventually retiring from service, kept the story largely to himself, sharing it only with a close circle of fellow researchers and UFO investigators, respecting the classification restrictions that had been placed on the case, even though he personally believed that the public had a right to know what had occurred. It wasn't until 2018, fully 40 years after the incident, and long after any reasonable classification justification had expired, that Filer chose to include the account in his published memoirs, finally putting the story into the public record in a form that could not be easily suppressed or denied. A decision that immediately drew the attention of UFO researchers, journalists and skeptics who began trying to verify the details, track down other witnesses, and determine whether this remarkable tale was based in fact or was merely one more unverifiable story in a field that is already crowded with dubious claims and unsubstantiated reports. When Filer's book was published and the story of the McGuire Air Force Base incident became widely known, journalists from mainstream media outlets reached out to the United States Air Force Public Affairs Office, requesting comment, clarification, or official denial of the events described in the account, questions that any responsible news organization would ask when confronted with such an extraordinary claim involving military personnel and official installations. The Air Force response was perhaps more telling than any confirmation could have been. They simply declined to comment at all, offering no denial, no confirmation, no explanation, no dismissal of the story as fantasy or fabrication, just complete silence, a vacuum where some kind of official position should have been. This non-response approach is consistent with how the military typically handles inquiries about classified programs or sensitive incidents that they neither want to confirm nor can effectively deny without opening themselves up to further questions and scrutiny. Not content with the Air Force's silence, investigative journalists began tracking down and reaching out to other former servicemen who had been stationed at either Fort Dix or McGuire Air Force Base during the 1977-1978 timeframe, attempting to find corroborating witnesses, or at least individuals who might have heard rumors or second-hand accounts of the incident from their fellow servicemen. The responses these inquiries generated were mixed and revealed the deep divisions that still exist regarding this case, even among those who were present on the base during that period. Some former personnel confirmed that they had indeed heard rumors at the time about something strange having occurred. Whispered conversations in the barracks or the mess hall about an alien being shot by security. Stories that circulated briefly before being shut down by officers who made it clear that such talk was not to continue. Warnings that were delivered with sufficient seriousness that most personnel took the hint and stopped discussing the matter, at least openly. Others recalled unusual activities on the base during that time frame, increased security presence, areas that were suddenly off limits without explanation, the arrival of personnel who were not regular base staff and who seemed to have authority that superseded local command. All the hallmarks of something significant having occurred that was being managed at levels above the normal base operations structure. Among the former servicemen who came forward with information was a man named Jeff Morse, who had served as a military policeman at Fort Dix during the relevant period, and who claimed that he had been part of the group that responded to the scene after the shooting occurred, that he had personally seen the body lying on the runway at McGuire, and that his recollections of the entity's appearance matched the details that Filer had described: the childlike size, the disproportionately large head, the huge black almond-shaped eyes, the leathery grayish skin, and most memorably, the overwhelming ammonia-like stench that had filled the air around the body, a smell so powerful and so alien that it had been one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire experience. The kind of sensory memory that stays with you for decades because it is so unlike anything else you have ever encountered. Morse's willingness to come forward and corroborate key details of the account on the record, using his real name and acknowledging his military service, added significant weight to the case because corroboration from independent witnesses who are willing to identify themselves is relatively rare in UFO research, where many witnesses prefer to remain anonymous due to fear of ridicule or professional consequences. However, not everyone who had been stationed at the bases during that time was willing to support the account, and several veterans came forward to express skepticism or outright denial that any such incident could have occurred. Among the skeptics were two former commanding officers who had held senior positions at the installations during the late 1970s, both of whom insisted that had an event of this magnitude occurred on their watch, they absolutely would have been informed that it would have been impossible for something so significant to take place without their knowledge and involvement, and that they had no recollection of any such incident being reported or handled during their tenure. These officers suggested that the entire story might be based on misunderstandings, embellishments of some more mundane event, or perhaps even a deliberately fabricated tale designed to gain attention or serve some other agenda. Other veterans echoed this skepticism, arguing that military bases are not places where secrets of this magnitude can be kept for long. that too many people would have been involved in responding to and processing such an incident, and that someone would have talked openly long before 40 years had passed, that the story would have leaked in verifiable form through official documents, photographs, or multiple independent witnesses coming forward simultaneously, rather than emerging piecemeal over decades. The arguments from skeptics carry some weight and deserve serious consideration, because they raise valid questions about how such an extraordinary event could remain largely hidden for so long, how physical evidence could be completely suppressed, and how dozens or potentially hundreds of personnel who would have had some knowledge of the incident could all be kept silent through classification orders, threats, or intimidation. Yet the counter-argument is equally compelling. We know from declassified documents and historical research that the military is, in fact, extremely effective at maintaining operational security when it chooses to do so. That programs have been successfully kept secret for decades. That personnel can be and have been silenced through a combination of security oaths, legal threats, career consequences, and in some cases alleged intimidation, and that the track record of government transparency regarding UFO-related matters has been, to put it charitably, less than exemplary. The existence of Project Blue Book alone, which ran for nearly 2 decades and concluded that UFOs posed no threat to national security, despite the fact that a significant percentage of cases remained unexplained and some involved clear evidence of advanced technology, demonstrates that official conclusions about these phenomena do not always align with the actual evidence or with the assessments of investigators who worked on the cases. So where does this leave us with the McGuire Air Force Base incident? Is it a genuine encounter that has been successfully suppressed for 4 decades? Or is it an elaborate myth that has grown in the telling, fed by the UFO research community's desire for dramatic cases and by the tendency of eyewitness accounts to become embellished over time? Before we try to answer that question, it is worth exploring some of the possible explanations for what occurred that night, starting with the most skeptical and working our way toward the more extraordinary possibilities, because intellectual honesty demands that we examine all plausible scenarios rather than simply accepting the most sensational interpretation. The most prosaic explanation, and one that skeptics often point to in cases like this, is that the entire incident was an elaborate hoax or prank perpetrated by off-duty personnel against their colleagues, a scenario that might sound implausible, but which has historical precedent in military culture. Military service, particularly during peacetime or periods of routine duty, can be characterized by long stretches of boredom, punctuated by brief moments of intense activity. And in that environment, pranks and practical jokes serve as both entertainment and a test of how personnel respond under pressure. There are documented cases of remarkably elaborate hoaxes being carried out on military bases, some involving sophisticated props, multiple conspirators, and detailed planning that would rival any Hollywood production. If we accept this explanation, the scenario might have involved someone creating a fake alien body using materials available on the base or brought in from outside, perhaps with accomplices manipulating lights or drones to simulate the hovering craft, staging the entire encounter to terrify or confuse the guards on duty, perhaps not anticipating that the situation would escalate to the point of actual weapons fire. Once shots were fired and the hoax spiraled out of control, those responsible would have had strong incentives to disappear the evidence and remain silent to avoid courts-martial for endangering personnel and wasting military resources. And the military itself might have chosen to suppress the incident to avoid the embarrassment of admitting that its security forces had been so thoroughly fooled. This explanation has a certain appeal because it requires no violation of known physical laws, no conspiracy involving hundreds of people, and no existence of alien life, but it also has significant weaknesses. Would a hoax really have been so convincing that multiple trained military personnel, some of whom would have combat experience and familiarity with human anatomy, could not recognize it as fake upon close examination? Could a prank generate that reportedly overwhelming ammonia smell that multiple witnesses described? And would the military really have dispatched a C-141 from Wright-Patterson and removed personnel from their assignments to handle what they knew to be a hoax? An alternative conventional explanation is that the incident was actually a covert training exercise or psychological operation designed to test how personnel would respond to a scenario for which they had no training or protocol, essentially an unannounced drill or experiment with the participants not informed that they were being tested. Military organizations do conduct such exercises, sometimes with extraordinary realism and secrecy, to evaluate readiness, test new protocols, or study human behavior under stress. And it is conceivable that what the witnesses experienced was actually a carefully orchestrated scenario involving props, actors, and simulated technology designed to create an encounter situation. Following this interpretation, the entire event, including the shooting, might have been part of the exercise, perhaps using theatrical effects to simulate a fatality, and the subsequent classification and suppression of information would have been part of the operational security around the training program, with participants either never informed of the true nature of what they experienced or briefed afterwards and sworn to secrecy. The problem with this explanation is similar to the hoax scenario. It seems almost more elaborate and difficult to execute than the phenomenon itself would be. It requires assuming that the psychological impact on personnel was deemed acceptable collateral damage for whatever data or insights the exercise was meant to generate. And it leaves unanswered the question of why such an exercise would be conducted without any apparent follow-up training or policy changes that might have resulted from the lessons learned. Moving into more extraordinary territory, we have the possibility that what was encountered was not extraterrestrial, but rather some form of classified experimental biology project, perhaps involving genetic engineering or the development of human-animal hybrids for military purposes. Research that would be deeply unethical and possibly illegal under international law, but which some conspiracy theorists believe has been conducted in secret facilities for decades. Under this scenario, the entity that was shot might have been an escaped specimen from some underground laboratory, an experiment that had gone wrong or broken containment, and the rapid response and aggressive suppression of information would have been driven by the need to prevent public knowledge of the program's existence. This explanation has the advantage of potentially accounting for the genuinely unusual physical characteristics of the being while keeping the explanation terrestrial and avoiding the need to invoke alien visitation. But it also requires accepting that such a program exists, has remained secret for decades, and involves research so advanced that it can create beings that appear completely non-human, claims for which there is no substantive evidence, and which strain credulity perhaps as much as the extraterrestrial hypothesis itself. Then there is the explanation that takes the witnesses at their word and accepts that what occurred was exactly what it appeared to be, an encounter between US military personnel and an extraterrestrial being, culminating in the death of that being when it was perceived as a threat or intruder by a guard who made a split-second decision based on his training and the protocols he was expected to follow. This interpretation is supported by the consistency of witness accounts, the specific and unusual details that multiple independent sources have described, the pattern of official response that matches what would be expected if the government were trying to conceal an event of enormous significance, and the broader context of UFO sightings and encounters that have been reported by military personnel for decades. If we accept this explanation, then the craft hovering near the fence line was an extraterrestrial vehicle, possibly experiencing some kind of malfunction or conducting a landing for reasons we can only speculate about, and the being that was shot was either a crew member attempting to return to the craft before it departed, or perhaps an entity that had been outside the craft for other reasons and was left behind when the craft suddenly accelerated away in response to the guard's warning shot. The implications of this interpretation are staggering. It would mean that the United States military has, at least once and possibly multiple times, been involved in the killing of intelligent beings from other worlds. The bodies and technology have been recovered and are being studied in classified facilities, and that the government has maintained a comprehensive cover-up of these facts for generations, lying to the public, to Congress, and to the international community about perhaps the most significant discovery in human history. The question of why such secrecy would be maintained has been debated endlessly in UFO research circles, with explanations ranging from concerns about social disruption and religious upheaval that might result from confirmation of alien life to fears about technological advantage being lost if other nations gain access to recovered alien technology, to more sinister suggestions that some form of agreement or understanding exists between elements of the government and certain extraterrestrial groups, an understanding that requires keeping the broader population in the dark about the true nature of the relationship. Regardless of which explanation one finds most compelling, the case is strengthened by several factors that distinguish it from many other UFO reports. The involvement of multiple credible witnesses with verifiable military service records, the specificity of details about locations, dates, units, and procedures that can be checked and corroborated to some degree, the identification of Major George Filer as a named source willing to attach his reputation to the account, and the corroboration from other witnesses, like Jeff Morse, who have come forward with consistent descriptions despite having no apparent connection to Filer or opportunity to coordinate their stories, another element that adds credibility and context to the McGuire incident is its connection to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the facility where the body was allegedly transported and which has been central to UFO lore for 3/4 of a century. Wright-Patterson is not simply a name that researchers have attached to the story because it sounds dramatic or because it fits UFO mythology. It is a real installation with a documented history of involvement in the analysis of advanced aerospace technology and unexplained aerial phenomena. Located near Dayton, Ohio, Wright-Patterson was originally established as a military aviation testing and development facility in the early 20th century, and it became the center of American efforts to understand and reverse engineer advanced technology during and after World War II. When the war in Europe ended and Allied forces swept across Germany, capturing factories, laboratories, and research facilities, teams of American technical experts were deployed to identify and seize any advanced weapons systems, prototypes, or research data that might provide military advantage in the emerging post-war world. Among the most valuable captures were German jet engines, swept-wing aircraft designs, advanced guidance systems, and exotic weapons like the V-2 rocket, all of which were crated up and shipped back to the United States for detailed study. And the primary destination for much of this material was Wright-Patterson, where teams of engineers and scientists worked to understand the principles behind these innovations and determine how they could be adapted for American military use. This pattern of bringing captured or recovered advanced technology to Wright-Patterson continued throughout the Cold War, and the facility became synonymous with the cutting edge of aerospace research, a place where the boundaries of what was possible were constantly being pushed, and where the most classified programs in American military history were housed. It is within this historical context that the claims about UFO materials being stored and studied at Wright-Patterson must be understood. If such a program existed, Wright-Patterson would be the logical and perhaps inevitable location for it, based on the facility's mission, its security infrastructure, and its concentration of technical expertise. The allegations specifically related to UFOs at Wright-Patterson go back to the summer of 1947 and the Roswell incident, that foundational event in UFO history when something crashed on a ranch in New Mexico, was initially described by Army Air Force personnel as a flying disc, then was hastily redesignated as a weather balloon, sparking decades of speculation and controversy about what was really recovered and where it was taken. Multiple witnesses who claim to have been involved in the Roswell recovery or its aftermath have stated that debris and bodies from the crash site were flown to Wright-Patterson for analysis and storage, assertions that have been officially denied but which have persisted and been repeated by different sources over the years with sufficient consistency that they cannot be entirely dismissed as fabrication. During the 1950s and 1960s, Wright-Patterson was also the headquarters for the Air Force's official UFO investigation programs, Project Sign, Project Grudge, and the famous Project Blue Book, which ran from 1952 to 1969 and compiled reports on thousands of UFO sightings by military and civilian witnesses. While Blue Book's official conclusion was that UFOs did not represent a threat to national security and that the majority of sightings could be explained as misidentifications or natural phenomena, many of the investigators who worked on the project have since stated that the conclusions were predetermined by senior leadership. that the most compelling cases were deliberately excluded from the final reports or explained away with implausible rationalizations, and that there was a separate, more classified channel through which the truly significant cases were being reported and handled at levels above Blue Book's access. If we accept that Wright-Patterson has been the primary facility for the study of recovered UFO materials for decades, then the transportation of the McGuire entity to that location would be exactly what we would expect to occur, standard operating procedure for handling such a recovery, and the fact that the destination was specifically mentioned in the leaked documents and witness accounts actually strengthens the credibility of the overall story because it demonstrates consistency with the broader pattern of how such incidents have allegedly been managed. Beyond Wright-Patterson, there is another geographic element that adds an interesting dimension to the McGuire case: the proximity of the base to the Pine Barrens, that vast and mysterious wilderness area in southern New Jersey that has been the site of countless strange reports and unexplained phenomena over the centuries. The Pine Barrens is a region that seems to occupy a special place in the paranormal landscape of North America, a place where the boundary between the mundane and the extraordinary appears to be unusually permeable. This is the legendary home of the Jersey Devil, that cryptid creature that has been reported by witnesses for more than 200 years, described as having bat-like wings, a horse-like head and hoofed feet, a being that has been blamed for livestock killings, mysterious tracks, and eerie sounds echoing through the forest. But beyond the Jersey Devil, the Pine Barrens has also been the location of numerous UFO sightings, strange lights in the sky that move in impossible patterns, mysterious humming or vibrating sounds that emanate from underground or from the air with no identifiable source, and accounts of people experiencing missing time or disorientation when traveling through certain areas of the forest. Some researchers have speculated that certain geographical locations may serve as windows or portals where the barriers between dimensions are thinner than normal, allowing for easier passage of entities or phenomena that exist outside our normal reality, and the Pine Barrens, with its long history of strangeness, fits this profile. If there is any validity to this theory, then the proximity of Fort Dix and McGuire Air Force Base to the Pine Barrens might not be coincidental. It could be that UFOs and their occupants are drawn to, or are more frequently present in this region, for reasons related to its unusual properties, or alternatively, that the military deliberately chose to establish and maintain installations in this area, specifically because of the higher incidence of anomalous phenomena, using the bases as monitoring and response stations for encounters that might occur. Another possibility that some researchers have suggested is that after the shooting incident at McGuire, if it indeed occurred as described, the area might have become a focus of increased attention from whatever intelligence is behind the UFO phenomenon, that the death of one of their own might have prompted a response in the form of more frequent appearances or observations, either as attempts to locate their lost companion or as reconnaissance to assess what happened and whether humans pose a threat to their operations. This is, of course, highly speculative, but it provides a potential explanation for why UFO sightings in the region around Fort Dix and McGuire might have continued or even increased in the years following 1978, assuming that such an increase actually occurred and can be documented beyond anecdotal reports. The McGuire incident also invites comparison to other cases in which military personnel have allegedly had direct, sometimes violent, encounters with UFOs or their occupants, cases that follow similar patterns of official denial, witness intimidation, and suppression of evidence. One of the most frequently cited comparison cases is the death of Sergeant Jonathan Levet, who vanished while on patrol near White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico in 1956, and whose body was allegedly discovered days later in a mutilated condition that suggested some form of surgical or medical procedure had been performed on it. The lone witness to Levet's disappearance, a fellow serviceman, reported that they had been conducting a routine patrol when they encountered a strange aerial object, that Levet had approached it, despite warnings to stay back, and that he had been somehow lifted or drawn up into the craft, which then rapidly departed, leaving the other soldier in a state of shock and terror. When Levet's body was eventually found, it reportedly showed signs of precise incisions, removal of organs, and a level of exsanguination that forensic experts stated could not have been achieved with the medical technology available at the time, characteristics that are disturbingly similar to the pattern of animal mutilations that have been reported primarily in cattle but occasionally in other species throughout the American West and other regions for decades. Official reports claim that Levette was killed by a lightning strike, an explanation that those familiar with the case find laughable given the physical evidence and the testimony of the witness. But the explanation served its purpose of closing the case and preventing further investigation. Another comparison case that is often cited alongside McGuire is the death of Captain Thomas Mantell, a Kentucky Air National Guard pilot who crashed on January 7, 1948, after pursuing an unidentified object in the skies near Fort Knox. Mantell was one of several pilots who were diverted from a routine flight to investigate reports of a large, metallic object hovering or moving slowly through the area, something that had been observed by multiple witnesses on the ground, including the control tower personnel at Fort Knox itself. Broke formation with the other pilots and continued climbing in pursuit of the object, radiating back descriptions of what he was seeing, a metallic object of tremendous size, higher than he could safely climb in his P-51 Mustang fighter, which was not equipped with oxygen for high-altitude flight. Mantell's last transmission stated that he was continuing to climb to get a better look at the object, and shortly thereafter, his aircraft crashed to the ground, killing him instantly. The official explanation, which has changed multiple times over the decades, currently holds that Mantell was chasing the planet Venus, or possibly a skyhook balloon, a high-altitude weather balloon program that was classified at the time, and that he suffered from hypoxia due to lack of oxygen at high altitude, causing him to lose consciousness and crash. Critics of this explanation point out that Mantell was an experienced pilot who should have been aware of the dangers of hypoxia and his altitude limitations, that Venus would not have appeared as the large metallic object he described, and that the skyhook balloon explanation was only introduced years after the fact once that program was declassified, suggesting it might be a convenient cover story rather than the actual explanation. What these cases and others like them have in common with the McGuire incident is a pattern. Military personnel encounter something unexplained. There are witnesses to at least part of the event. Official explanations are provided that often seem inadequate or contradictory to the evidence, and any serious investigation is shut down or classified to prevent public scrutiny. This pattern is what gives researchers confidence that there is a genuine phenomenon being covered up, that the secrecy is not simply a matter of protecting classified military projects or avoiding embarrassment, but rather is part of a comprehensive, decades-long effort to prevent the public from learning the truth about the reality of UFOs and the extent of human-alien interaction. In light of these historical patterns, the recent moves toward transparency by the Pentagon regarding UAPs, while welcome in some respects, ring hollow to many researchers who have been studying this field for decades. Yes, the government has now admitted that there are objects in our skies that we cannot identify and that appear to demonstrate technology beyond our current capabilities. Yes, they have released footage and acknowledged that investigations are ongoing. Yes, congressional hearings have been held and task forces established, but all of this apparent openness is limited to recent incidents, mostly naval encounters from the 2000s and 2010s, while the extensive history of earlier cases, the alleged crash retrievals, the witness testimony from retired military and intelligence personnel about recovery and reverse engineering programs, and cases like McGuire where direct confrontations allegedly occurred, remain officially unacknowledged and continue to be treated as conspiracy theories, despite substantial evidence and witness testimony supporting them. This selective transparency suggests that the government is managing a carefully controlled disclosure process, revealing only what they choose to reveal when they choose to reveal it, possibly preparing the public gradually for more significant admissions to come, or alternatively, using the admission of the relatively mundane fact that we sometimes see things in the sky we cannot identify as a way to diffuse public pressure for disclosure while continuing to conceal the most significant aspects of the phenomenon: physical evidence, recovered materials, and direct contact with non-human intelligence. Until the government is willing to open the files on cases like Roswell, Rendlesham Forest, Mantell, Leavitt, and yes, the McGuire Air Force Base incident, until they are willing to provide access to whatever materials, photographs, documents, and physical evidence they have accumulated over 3/4 of a century of investigation, and until they are willing to let independent scientists and researchers examine that evidence without restriction or prior classification. The claims of transparency will remain just that, claims that are not backed up by the kind of full disclosure that the significance of this subject demands. So where does all of this leave us regarding the McGuire Air Force Base incident specifically? We have a detailed account from a credible military officer who claims to have investigated the incident firsthand within hours of its occurrence. We have corroborating testimony from at least one other witness who claims to have been present and to have seen the body. We have a story that is consistent with the historical pattern of how the military has allegedly handled other UFO-related incidents. We have specific details about locations, units, procedures, and destinations that can be partially verified, and that demonstrate the witnesses have genuine familiarity with the installations and operations they describe. And we have the notable fact that official sources have refused to deny the incident or provide any alternative explanation, choosing instead to maintain complete silence when questioned. On the other hand, we have the absence of incontrovertible physical evidence available for independent examination. We have skeptical testimony from other personnel who were present at the bases during the same period and who claim to have heard nothing about such an incident. We have the inherent difficulty of proving a negative, that is, of definitively demonstrating that something did not occur, when those who would have the evidence to prove it did occur refuse to provide that evidence. And we have the general challenge that faces all UFO cases, which is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And witness testimony alone, no matter how credible the witness is, may not be sufficient to meet that standard. My personal assessment, having examined this case in detail along with the broader context of UFO history and military secrecy, is that something significant occurred at Fort Dix and McGuire Air Force Base on the night of January 18, 1978. That multiple military personnel encountered something they could not explain, that the incident was serious enough to prompt a rapid and comprehensive response involving transport aircraft and classified handling procedures, and that the subsequent suppression of information and removal of witnesses suggests that whatever occurred was considered highly sensitive by military and intelligence leadership. Whether what occurred was exactly as Major Filer described, the shooting and killing of an extraterrestrial being, or whether it was something else that has been misinterpreted or misremembered over the decades, is impossible to determine with certainty given the available evidence. But I do not believe this case can be simply dismissed as fabrication or fantasy. Given the credentials of the witnesses and the specificity of their accounts, the larger truth, the one that transcends any individual case including McGuire, is that there is overwhelming evidence accumulated over 3/4 of a century from thousands of witnesses including military personnel, intelligence officers, pilots, astronauts, radar operators, and ordinary citizens, that we are being visited by something, whether extraterrestrial beings from other worlds, extra-dimensional entities from parallel realities, time travelers from our own future, or something else entirely that we lack the conceptual framework to properly understand. The technology that has been repeatedly observed and documented demonstrates capabilities that are far beyond anything in the public domain, and quite possibly beyond anything possessed by any nation on Earth. Instantaneous acceleration from rest to hypersonic speeds, 90-degree turns at velocities that would generate hundreds of Gs of force, transitions from air to water without any apparent change in propulsion, ability to render themselves invisible to the naked eye while remaining visible to infrared sensors, or vice versa, and apparent manipulation of gravity or space-time itself, given the absence of conventional propulsion signatures like jet wash or rocket exhaust. These are not characteristics of any known terrestrial technology, and while it is theoretically possible that some nation has made breakthrough discoveries in physics and engineering that allow for these capabilities, and has managed to keep those discoveries completely secret for decades while conducting test flights over American military installations, That explanation strains credulity as much as or more than the extraterrestrial hypothesis. So we are left with a mystery, one that has profound implications for our understanding of our place in the universe, our technological future, our philosophical and religious frameworks, and our political and social structures. If we are indeed being visited, and if our governments know about it and have been concealing that knowledge for generations, then we are living in a world where the most important fact about reality is being deliberately kept from the vast majority of humanity. And the reasons for that concealment, whether they are considered justified by those maintaining the secrecy or not, deserve to be debated openly rather than decided by a small group of unelected officials operating in complete darkness beyond any democratic oversight or accountability. And if the McGuire incident is real, if an American serviceman really did shoot and kill an unarmed being that was simply trying to return to its craft, a being that may have been an explorer, a scientist, a student of humanity, someone's child or parent or friend, then we have to ask ourselves what kind of first impression we made, what message we sent to whatever intelligence is behind these craft, and whether the hostility and violence with which we responded to their presence might have consequences that we are only beginning to understand. Because if they are watching, if they are studying us, if they are deciding whether humanity is ready to join some larger community of intelligent beings in the universe, then that night in January 1978, on a military base in New Jersey, might have been a defining moment, a test that we failed catastrophically, and the silence we have heard from them in the decades since, the absence of open contact or acknowledged communication, might be our answer. Not yet, not you, not while you react to the unknown with fear and violence, not while you keep secrets from yourselves and lie to your own people about the most important questions existence can ask. The incident at McGuire Air Force Base, whether it occurred exactly as described or in some variation of that account, stands as a symbol of humanity's current relationship with the UFO phenomenon, characterized by fear, secrecy, confusion, occasional violence, and an inability or unwillingness to confront the implications of what we are witnessing. Until that changes, until we demand and receive the truth about what our governments know and have known for decades, we will remain in this strange twilight state, aware that something extraordinary is happening, catching glimpses of it in leaked videos and whistleblower testimony, but never quite able to see the full picture, never quite able to move forward into whatever future awaits us on the other side of disclosure. The guard who pulled the trigger that night had perhaps 3 seconds to make a decision, operating on instinct and training in a situation for which no training could have prepared him, and in that moment, he acted as humans have acted throughout our history when confronted with the unknown. He perceived a threat, and he eliminated it. But we collectively, 4 decades later, have had much more than 3 seconds to think about these questions, to demand answers, to push for transparency, and to decide what kind of species we want to be when we finally take our place among whatever other intelligences share this universe with us. The story of McGuire is not just about what happened on one cold night in 1978. It is about what continues to happen every day, that we allow the truth to remain hidden. Every day that we accept the official denials and the explanations that don't quite add up. Every day that we allow the most important question humanity has ever faced to be answered not by open inquiry and democratic debate, but by secret committees and classified programs operating beyond any meaningful oversight or accountability. Whatever really happened at Fort Dix and McGuire Air Force Base that January night, one thing is absolutely certain. The truth, whatever it is, deserves to be known. And those who have kept it hidden for so long have some very difficult questions to answer about why they made that choice and what right they had to make it on behalf of all of humanity.